My name is Amelia Rowan Hart. I am 30 years old, and the last time I tried to thank my father for everything he had done, he looked me in the eye and told me I would always be last. It happened at his retirement barbecue. 38 years at the same accounting firm, 3.5 decades of early mornings, late nights, and never more than 2 weeks off at a time. When they finally gave him a send-off, the ceremony at his office felt more like a funeral than a celebration. People made speeches, shook his hand, and told him he was the kind of man they did not make anymore. Dependable, stoic, a rock. Growing up, that was exactly the problem. He was a rock, solid, unmoving, and impossible to get anything soft out of. He was not cruel, not in the way people usually mean when they say that. He did not scream. He did not throw things. He just treated emotions like liabilities in a balance sheet. If you cried, you were dramatic. If you asked for reassurance, you were needy. If you wanted to hear the words, "I am proud of you," you were being childish. I can count on one hand the number of times he said anything close to that, and even then it came attached to some correction about how I could have done better. He believed in work, in silence, in getting things done without making a show. Love was never part of the package, not the way I needed it to be. So when his retirement weekend came around, I told myself this could be a turning point, a chance to put something clean between us. Closure, maybe, or the start of something different. I planned the barbecue down to the last detail. My house, my money, my backyard. I hired a catering company, rented a tent because the forecast said light rain, even brought in one of those outdoor bar carts with a mixologist making custom drinks. Neighbors came, old co-workers, a couple of his golf buddies. My mom floated around like she always does, taking credit with her smile and fluttering hands, even though she had not lifted a finger to plan it. Everyone kept thanking her like she had done everything. I let it slide. That was not the point. The point was the watch. I had been saving for it longer than I wanted to admit, even though I could afford it now. A Rolex Submariner, black dial, classic. It was the kind of thing I knew he respected in a wordless way. Precision, status, clean lines. On the back, I had the jeweler engrave 4 words. Thank you for everything. I did not want it to be dramatic. I did not want a scene. I wanted a moment that felt simple and clear, like sliding a final puzzle piece into place. So I waited until the food was mostly gone and the buzz of wine and bourbon had softened everyone's edges. People were laughing at old stories that were only half true, talking about the early days at the firm, the long nights, the numbers he could balance in his head. I caught his eye and nodded toward the edge of the yard. We stepped away from the tent, out near the fence where the string lights faded and the air felt cooler. I got you something, I said, holding out the small velvet box. He opened it, looked down at the watch, flipped it over. His eyes passed over the engraving, then came back to my face. For a second, I thought I saw something soften. A crack in the mask he always wore. Then he spoke. "You think money can buy love?" he said quietly. "You will always be the last." He said it like he was stating the weather. No anger, no hesitation, just a verdict. As if I were some stranger handing him a bribe instead of his daughter handing him a gesture she had been rehearsing in her head for weeks. For a heartbeat, everything inside me went very still. I felt the heat rise in my throat, the instinctive urge to argue, to explain, to say this is not about the money, this is about me trying one more time. But years of swallowing my feelings had trained me too well. Instead, I simply reached out, took the box back from his hand, and closed it. I did not say a word. I turned around and walked across the yard, past the tent, past the grill, past my mother's wide eyes, and the curious stares of people who thought they knew us. I walked straight through the side gate, unlocked my car, and drove away with the watch still in my hand. I did not hear my mother shouting until I was already on the street. I did not know if anyone followed me, or if they just stood there watching me leave, wondering how someone could be so ungrateful. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with the first wave of calls. I put it on silent, dropped the watch on my kitchen table, and went to bed with my clothes still smelling like smoke and barbecue sauce. The next morning, my phone was a wall of missed calls. 71, all from my parents. 17 voicemails. The first few were my mother, demanding that I bring back the watch, that I stop being dramatic, that I remember everything they had done for me. Somewhere in the middle was my father, talking about how I had embarrassed him in front of people who really mattered, how I had tried to make a fool of him, how I was always trying to be a hero with my money. I lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling, while his voice echoed through the speaker. He made it sound like I had staged some public humiliation, like I had weaponized a gift to rewrite my place in the family. He did not mention the engraving. He did not mention the years I had spent trying to prove I belonged. I almost deleted the messages without listening to the rest. Instead, I made coffee, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and tried to pretend it was a normal Monday. I answered a few work emails, half-hearted and distracted, the weight of the weekend pressing down like a second ceiling. I was not planning to do anything. I thought I would just ignore them until they ran out of energy or found a new crisis. Then one voicemail changed everything. It was my father again, but this time his voice was calm in a way that always meant something ugly underneath. "You embarrass me in front of people who really matter," he said. "If you think you can just throw money around and rewrite who you are in this family, you are more lost than I thought." Something inside me tipped. All the years of trying, of quietly carrying their weight, of paying bills and pretending it was no big deal, clicked into place in a way that suddenly made me feel very, very clear. I opened a different browser tab, logged into a separate bank account, the one I had set up years ago when I was still desperate to earn my place, the one I had been using to pay their mortgage. What they never knew, what I never told anyone, not even my boyfriend, was that everything was in my name. I was the one on the account. I was the one with full control. It had started as a 6-month favor during a rough patch, just until they got back on their feet. Then it became a year, then 2. Eventually, it turned permanent. They stopped asking how it was paid. They stopped pretending to be grateful. The house just stayed theirs, and the money just kept leaving my account like a quiet tide. I had built up a buffer, little by little, enough to cover nearly a year if anything went wrong. A safety net for them, not for me. That morning, with my father's words still echoing in my ears, I selected the full balance and transferred all $46,000 back into my personal account. The confirmation screen popped up. "Are you sure?" I was. Then I called the mortgage company, gave them my name, told them I would no longer be making payments, that any further responsibility belonged to the original borrowers. The man on the phone hesitated, asked if I understood what that meant. Foreclosure was not a word he said out loud, but it sat there between us anyway. "I understand," I said. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from regret, from something that felt a lot like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. By late afternoon, my mother had found out. The text started slow. "Are you having problems with the bank?" Then faster. The payment bounced, then harsher. "You were not really going to let them take the house." I put my phone face down and went for a walk. The air outside felt heavy, like a storm was waiting just out of sight. My boyfriend Ethan called while I was on the sidewalk. I almost did not pick up, but I did. He listened without interrupting while I told him what I had done. The watch, the barbecue, the transfer, the phone call to the bank. "Are you safe?" he asked finally. "Is your place secure? Your locks? Your building?" Trust Ethan to go straight to the part that mattered most. "I am fine," I said. "I just stopped paying for their life." For a long moment, all I could hear was his breathing. "Then stay firm," he said. "And if anything feels off, you call me before you call anyone else. Promise me, Amelia." I promised. When I got back to my apartment, there were 3 voicemails from my uncle, one from my sister Laura, and a new email from my father titled, "We Need to Talk." I did not open it. Not that day. Not after what happened next. The next day, at 8 in the morning, someone buzzed my apartment. The sound cut through the quiet like an alarm I had forgotten to turn off. I froze with my coffee halfway to my mouth, staring at the intercom like it might bite. No one ever just dropped by. Not without texting first, not without warning. After everything that had happened at the barbecue, after the voicemails and the email titled, "We Need to Talk," there was only one logical conclusion about who it was. I didn't answer. The buzzing stopped, then started again. Longer this time, more insistent, as if sheer persistence could punch through a locked door and a lifetime of swallowed boundaries. I set my coffee down and leaned back so I was out of sight of the peephole, listening to the muffled echo of my name distorted through the metal. "Amelia, open the door. We need to talk." My mother's voice. I watched her shadow shift under the door, that small strip of movement on the floorboards. For 25 minutes, she knocked, called my name, waited, knocked again. Once upon a time, that would have dragged me to the door. Guilt would have dragged me. The fear of being called ungrateful, dramatic, cruel. But sitting there in my own kitchen, I felt something else instead, a strange hollow calm. Eventually, the knocking stopped. I waited another 5 minutes before I moved. When I finally opened the door, there was no one there. Just a folded note on the mat with my name written on it. I picked it up, felt the weight of it in my hand, imagined all the words inside, every line about sacrifice and disappointment and everything they had done for me. Then I dropped it straight into the trash without unfolding it. For the rest of the day, I worked, or at least I tried to. I answered client emails, sat through a Zoom meeting with my camera off, nodded at the right times, while people talked about timelines and deliverables. On another screen, my banking app sat open, numbers rearranged into something that finally felt like they belonged to me. Around 9 that night, there was another knock. 2 short, sharp raps, not the impatient pounding my mother used. Something cooler, measured. I walked softly to the door and checked the peephole. I half expected to see my mother again, or my sister Laura, flown in from Denver with that tight look she got when she was trying to keep the peace between everyone. Instead, a man stood in the hallway. Someone I didn't recognize at first glance. Black jacket, gray pants, the kind of generic face you'd lose in a crowd if you weren't looking for it. He waited a moment, then looked straight at the peephole, like he knew I was there. I opened the door a fraction, chain still latched. "Can I help you?" I asked. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a card or a reason to trust that he belonged anywhere near my front door. "Your dad sends his regards," he said, voice flat. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, not in a hurry, not looking back, just delivering a line and exiting the scene like he had done it 1,000 times. I shut the door slowly, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the caffeine I'd been living on. For a few minutes, I just stood there with my back against the wood, listening to my pulse in my ears, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. The next morning, I knew I wasn't. When I left for work, I noticed fresh scratches around my front door lock. Tiny metal scars, the kind that don't happen by accident. In the stairwell, my neighbor Tom stopped me, his brow furrowed. "Hey, Amelia," he said. "You all right? Some guy was around yesterday asking what time you usually get home. Said he was an old friend of yours. Didn't look like a friend." Tom was retired, bored, and nosy in a way that usually annoyed me. In that moment, I could have hugged him. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That I didn't know," Tom said. "And I told him I didn't like people asking questions about other tenants. Figured you should know." By lunchtime, I was sitting in a small, beige room at the police station, filing a report. I went through everything in order: the visit at my door, the fresh marks on the lock, the questions in the hallway. The officer taking notes looked tired but attentive. When I described the man, his expression sharpened. "Do you know his name?" he asked. I hesitated, replaying the retirement barbecue in my head. There had been a man in the corner that day, drinking whiskey, barely saying a word. Someone my dad had introduced with that vague tone he used when he didn't want to explain too much. I remembered the name then. I said it out loud. The officer's pen paused over the page. "He's not just some random guy," he said finally. "He had a license as a private investigator until a few years ago. Now he does freelance work, mostly for people who want information and don't want to be officially seen asking questions." "I'm guessing my father falls into that category," I said, my voice dry. The officer didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between us. When I got home that evening, shaken but weirdly numb, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Call me when you're alone." I called him from the couch, staring at the door like it might grow eyes. He listened while I told him about the man, the scratches, the report. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence on the line. "He's not going to stop," Ethan said quietly. "Not because he's hurt, because he thinks he's losing control." The word made my stomach twist. Losing control. For my father, that was worse than losing money, worse than losing a house. As if to prove Ethan's point, a new message slid onto my screen right then. Not from my father. From a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, it's Jenna. We've never met, but I used to date Ethan. I think we need to talk." For a second, I thought it might be some messy romantic drama trying to crawl out of the past. Ethan had told me about Jenna before, how they'd ended things cleanly, how there wasn't any lingering tension. I put the call on speaker and opened the message thread. I wrote back, "Is everything okay?" She responded almost immediately. "Some guy came to my office today, said he was handling a family matter. Asked a lot of questions about you, if you seemed reckless, if you ever talked about doing something dangerous with money. asked about your mental health. At first, I thought he was a debt collector. Then he mentioned your dad's full name. I felt the blood drain from my face. Ethan's voice came through the speaker, tense now. What happened? I read the messages out loud. He swore under his breath, the kind of low, angry sound I didn't hear often from him. So he's using Jenna now, Ethan said, trying to build a story about you, trying to paint you as unstable. Character assassination. Third-party gaslighting. Laying groundwork for some future move where I wasn't just the ungrateful daughter who walked away, but the dangerous one, the unpredictable one, the one you shouldn't trust with money or decisions, or maybe even her own freedom. A chill settled over me, cold and steady. My father wasn't just angry, he was planning something. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling my heart thud against my ribs, the same heart that had already warned me once how much more it could take. Around midnight, I got up, padded barefoot to my desk, and opened my laptop. There was one folder on my desktop I had never thought I'd need, something I had created years ago, in a mix of paranoia and dark humor. I had called it contingency. A joke. Insurance I never planned to cash in. I clicked it open. Inside were screenshots, email threads, scans of old checks, little pieces of information I had collected over the years, the way you'd pocket small stones without thinking about why. Things that had made me uncomfortable at the time, things I told myself were probably nothing. My dad's messages to an old business partner about creative tax write-offs. My mom depositing money into her personal account from funds that were supposed to be earmarked for something else. At the time, I hadn't known what to do with any of it. Now I did. And buried deep in those documents was something I had almost forgotten about. The trust my grandfather had left to me and Laura. A trust my parents clearly thought they understood better than we did. I opened the trust folder expecting the same old numbers, the same balance that had sat untouched for years. My grandfather, meticulous even in death, had left Laura and me equal shares, split cleanly right down the middle once we each turned 30. The clause was simple. If one of us was ever deemed unfit to manage the money, emotionally, financially, legally, the other would take temporary control until the situation stabilized. At the time, everyone assumed that clause was about me. My parents made jokes about how I was too impulsive, how I felt too much, how Laura was the responsible one who'd keep me grounded. They never said it cruelly. They didn't have to. It was the undercurrent of every comment, every comparison. But after our grandfather died, a strange thing happened. The attorney named me temporary trustee. He had known me better than anyone else, even my parents. He told me privately that he'd chosen me because I knew the difference between loyalty and sacrifice. I hadn't touched a cent. I meant to hand the control over the moment Laura hit 30. But as I scrolled through the statements now, something felt off. Laura's half wasn't intact. Over 3 years, almost $120,000 had been drained. Not in obvious chunks, but disguised as administrative fees to companies I'd never heard of. Consultancy invoices from businesses with no websites. Charitable donations to nonprofits that didn't appear in any directory. Sloppy shell work. And every trail led in one direction, back to my parents. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, feeling a quiet, rising nausea. They hadn't just siphoned money from me. They had stolen from their other daughter, the daughter who still answered their calls, the easy one, the one they bragged about. I compiled everything into a neat packet, screenshots, dates, amounts, highlighted trails, and sent it to Laura with no explanation. She called 20 minutes later. Her voice was steady at first, too steady. "You stole from me," she said. I took a breath. "No, they did." Silence. Then an exhale that sounded like something old snapping in her chest. "You're sure?" I traced every line. "It all leads to them." Another silence. A long one. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed. It wasn't shaky. It wasn't angry. It was cold. "Then let's burn it down." For the first time in weeks, I almost smiled. Laura arrived the next morning without warning, hauling a duffel bag and a manila folder thicker than mine. She had her own receipts. Texts from our mom asking her to lie to bank tellers. Emails from our dad hinting that he needed access to her accounts just for a few months. Invoices she'd questioned but been told to drop. We sat at my kitchen table like two detectives going through case files about strangers. Except they weren't strangers. They were our parents. By noon, we had a complete timeline. By 2, we had a list of every questionable transaction. By 3, The file was sent to my parents' accountant, not as a threat, but as a warning. We expected panic, maybe tears, maybe denial. We didn't expect silence. 2 days passed with nothing. No calls, no texts, no knocks at my door. Laura stayed at my place, sleeping on the couch with one eye open, her phone clutched tight in her hand each night. On the third morning, we finally got a response. Not from them, from their lawyer. My clients request an immediate cease and desist. Any further distribution of private financial information will be considered a criminal offense. This is your only warning. No greeting, no explanation, no attempt to resolve anything. Just a thinly veiled threat. I forwarded it to Laura. She didn't reply with words, just a photo. Their house, taken from the street. A bright red foreclosure notice in the yard. This morning, she texted, they were already in default. I realized then something I hadn't let myself believe. They had been drowning long before I pulled the mortgage payments. My support had only delayed the inevitable. But the worst wasn't the foreclosure. It was what happened when Laura went there. She didn't tell me until after. She knew I'd have tried to stop her. She knocked on the door. Our mother opened it, looked her up and down, and said nothing. For an entire minute, just studied her like she was some fragile thing that had appeared on the porch. Then our father came to the doorway. He didn't yell. He didn't ask why she was there. He just stared at her and said, "You're as broken as she is." Laura told me she didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulled out the packet of trust documents, and handed them to him. "How do you think this ends?" she asked. She said his face shifted, not with guilt or fear, with confusion, like he'd forgotten whose money it was to begin with. Then, unexpectedly, he sat down on the stairs. No anger, no raised voice, just muttered about how he built everything from nothing, how we didn't understand pressure, how we were spoiled, ungrateful. Laura left before he could spiral into one of his rants. That night, I walked to my car to grab a charger I'd left there. I noticed the door was slightly ajar, but nothing was missing. Not my sunglasses, not the laptop in the back seat, not the coins in the console. Instead, on the driver's seat, an envelope. Inside was a photograph, me, taken from across the street, leaving my apartment 2 days earlier. On the back, in messy handwriting, "You went too far." My knees went weak. For the first time since the barbecue, I felt afraid. Not for my reputation, not for my inheritance, for my safety. I called Laura immediately. "We're done here," I said. "I'm going out of town for a few days." She didn't argue. I am doing the same. No dramatic goodbyes, no long explanations. Just two sisters finally realizing they were no longer dealing with family conflict, but with something darker. We packed bags, turned off our phones, and disappeared. I drove north with the kind of numb, focused clarity that only comes when fear has burned away every other emotion. I didn't tell Ethan where I was going, only that I was safe, that I'd call him when I could. Laura and I kept our phones off, agreeing to check in once a day from prepaid burners. For 3 days, I lived out of a motel room that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee, watching muted news on the TV while I waited for the adrenaline in my bloodstream to settle into something livable. When I finally returned home on the 4th day, my apartment was exactly as I left it. Neat, quiet, untouched. The building's security cameras showed no activity near my door while I was gone, but that didn't reassure me. I knew my father. His methods were never loud. He preferred pressure in the shadows, whispers, planted seeds, implied consequences. He would never kick down a door when he could simply loosen the hinges over time, which meant I needed to move first. The moment Laura got it back to Denver, she called me. "It's time," she said. Not angry, not panicked, just done. I opened my laptop and dialed our attorney, an expert in financial crimes and embezzlement whom I had met a week earlier when everything first began to crack. With her guidance, we filed an official complaint with the state. We included every piece of documentation: unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, fake invoices, cash movement through shell companies, fraudulent tax deductions. Laura even had a forensic handwriting expert verify our mother's signature on several documents. Everything was airtight. But the best part? We weren't even finished. Remember the second escrow account we discovered? The one hidden under a shell LLC with a name no one in our family had ever heard? At first, it had seemed like a sloppy attempt to stash whatever scraps were left, but then our attorney dug deeper. The account wasn't new. It had been active for 3 years, and every deposit matched the money siphoned from Laura's trust. There was still $86,000 sitting in it. We froze the account immediately. The same day, I made another strategic move, one that was less about money and more about social pressure. I called the HOA president in my parents' neighborhood, pretending to be a prospective homebuyer. I asked vague questions about community stability and financial concerns involving nearby properties. Then I casually mentioned rumors about an investigation tied to a house on their street. I didn't give a name. I didn't need to. A community like theirs thrived on reputation and gossip. Within 48 hours, the HOA issued a formal inquiry to my parents demanding clarification about financial irregularities. To people like them, that was worse than foreclosure, worse than legal trouble. It was humiliation. The next day, Laura called again, her voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Dad tried to call me twice. Then he left. This." She forwarded the voicemail. His voice was nothing like the man from my childhood, not the stern, unyielding accountant who lectured us on responsibility, nor the cold, dismissive man who told me I'd always be last. This voice was cracked, desperate. "We're losing everything," he said. "This is ruining us. People are talking. Your mother is falling apart. We need help. Please, please call back." Hearing him beg felt surreal. He had never begged for anything in his life, not once. I listened to the voicemail twice, then a third time. I expected triumph, vindication, something sharp and satisfying. Instead, I felt nothing. No warmth, no pity, no urge to reach back and give him even a fraction of the mercy I had offered him my entire life. I sent the voicemail to our attorney and archived it. Then I turned my phone off and sat in silence until the sun slipped below the windowsill. It took me a long time to realize the emotion wasn't apathy. It was grief. Not for him, for the version of him I had built in my head, a version that had never existed. And things were about to fracture even more. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A national reporter wanted to speak with me. The anonymous story I had posted online, the one detailing a family that misused a trust fund and hired a private investigator to stalk their own child, had gone viral. Hundreds of comments, thousands of shares, growing outrage. People were calling it the perfect storm of financial betrayal. I had expected it to get traction. I hadn't expected a news outlet to track it back to me. But I said yes to the interview on one condition: no names. Not yet. I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting myself, at least until every legal safeguard was in place. The interview aired online 2 days later, a blurred silhouette, a disguised voice, a story that spread like wildfire. That same night, something new surfaced. Laura found the third account, an offshore account, not under their names, but tied to the same shell company used to drain our trust. No money remained in it, but its existence meant one terrifying thing. There may have been more accounts, and more plans, and possibly much darker intentions. We brought everything into our attorney the next morning. She looked through the files, sat back, and said, "This is no longer just financial fraud. If these policies were used to facilitate disappearance payouts, this crosses into criminal territory." Laura and I shared a glance. Neither of us wanted to say the word that hovered between us. Disappearance payouts. Meaning, at some point, our parents had considered life without us. Not metaphorically, legally, financially, strategically. The room felt colder. We decided to give our parents a choice, our final act of mercy. The terms were simple. They relinquish all access to any trust accounts. They sign affidavits admitting financial wrongdoing. They leave the state permanently. They cut all contact. No calls, no emails, no messages. They had 7 days. On the 4th day, they agreed. No fight, no denial, just a single email. Send the papers. I didn't ask why they gave in so easily. I didn't want the answer. 2 days after everything was signed, a final email arrived, sent not to me, but to Laura. No greeting, just one paragraph. We thought we were building something strong. We didn't realize we were pouring concrete around our own feet. Tell your sister we lost the game the moment she smiled and walked away without the watch. Laura forwarded it with no comment. I read it once, deleted it, and that was it. Their house went to auction. Their accounts were frozen. Their reputations collapsed. They disappeared from every social platform like ghosts trying to outrun their own shadows. And me? I finally exhaled. Stop. Part 5. 1 year later, I didn't expect to ever revisit any of it. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, or at least from the ashes my parents left behind. I moved apartments, changed my email, added better locks, and spent the first few months jumping at every unexpected sound. But eventually, the fear faded. I slipped into something that almost felt like peace. Ethan and I grew stronger through it all. He never resented the chaos I brought into his orbit. He held the pieces with me, never once trying to take control or minimize what I was feeling. Sometimes late at night, he would say, "You know, you didn't break the family. You just stopped letting them break you." And I'd feel something inside me settle. Laura and I were closer than we had ever been as kids. Trauma has a way of welding broken pieces together. We talked at least twice a week, sometimes more. She flew out every few months carrying new recipes and that old, sarcastic laugh I had missed. We didn't talk about our parents unless necessary. Silence, we realized, was its own boundary. I hadn't heard from either of them since the settlement. No birthdays, no holidays, no passive-aggressive emails, nothing. They vanished as if they had never existed. Then the letter came. Not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter, postmarked from Oregon. No return address. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Small, neat loops that had filled every note in my childhood lunchboxes. My mother. I sat with the letter on the table for an hour before opening it. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't spike. I felt strange, detached, like reading a message from a former coworker I barely remembered. The first page was exactly what I expected. "We did what we thought was necessary. We only wanted to protect the family. You misinterpreted everything. We never stopped loving you, even when you turned your back on us." Same script, different paper, but the second page shifted. "You think you know everything, but your father didn't tell you what he did with the rest." I froze. The rest? I read the sentence again and again. There was no explanation, no follow-up, just that line. A knife disguised as a whisper. I texted Laura. "What does this mean?" She called immediately. "I don't know," she said. But her voice sounded like she knew exactly what I was thinking. There might still be more accounts, more hidden money, more secrets buried in places we hadn't learned to look. Our attorney confirmed something chilling. Offshore accounts rarely stand alone. If one existed, chances were high there were others hidden behind layers we hadn't uncovered. But after everything, we let it go. Neither of us wanted to spend our lives chasing ghosts. Not theirs, not our grandfather's, not whatever twisted financial footprint our father had left behind. "Let them keep their secrets," Laura said. "They're already living like shadows." She was right. People sometimes ask me, online, in comments, in private messages, if cutting them off was too harsh. If I should have tried harder. If I regret burning the bridge instead of repairing it. Here's the truth I've learned. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed again. Some bridges were never bridges at all, just ropes tied around your neck. When I finally cut the cord, it didn't snap loudly. It didn't explode. It broke quietly, softly, cleanly. And in the space where the rope used to be, I found oxygen. Ethan and I took a trip last month. A small mountain town, wood cabin, a balcony overlooking pine trees so tall they creaked in the wind. One night, while the fireplace crackled, he asked me, "If they showed up tomorrow and said they were sorry, would you go back?" I didn't have to think. "No," I said, because they were never trying to find me. They were trying to find control. He nodded, brushed his thumb across my hand, and said, "Good." We sat there in the quiet, wrapped in a peace I never thought I'd earn. Sometimes, when I check my mailbox, just every now and then, I half expect another letter, another cryptic message, another hint of something hidden. But most days there's nothing, and I'm grateful, because the absence of their voices isn't emptiness. It's freedom.